Deep within your biology operates a relentless metronome. Your respiratory system functions continuously, an involuntary circuit dedicated solely to sustaining metabolic life. Yet this critical survival mechanism holds a distinct physiological paradox. Unlike your heartbeat or your digestion, respiration is uniquely vulnerable to conscious interference. Anytime you speak, or when you sing, or dive underwater, you are overriding a biological imperative with a behavioral choice. To manage this tension, human breathing relies on a highly integrated hierarchy. It operates through neural pattern generators in the brainstem, mechanical safeguards woven into the lungs, and chemical thermostats monitoring the bloodstream. We are going to deconstruct the circuit from the brainstem outward. By isolating each component, we can map exactly how breathing manages to dynamically adapt to physical exercise, articulate speech, and extreme metabolic crises. Every breath represents a real-time negotiation between the strict demands of biological survival and the requirements of conscious behavior. The entire respiratory sequence originates deep within the unconscious architecture of the brainstem, specifically within the medullary respiratory centers. These are the dorsal and ventral respiratory groups, and they serve as the biological oscillators for your breathing pattern. This diagram maps the human medulla. Right here, the dorsal respiratory group, or DRG, generates the base rhythm. It primarily drives inspiration, firing repetitive, baseline oscillatory signals to the diaphragm to trigger a breath in. During quiet breathing, the DRG works alone, while expiration happens passively. But when metabolic demand spikes, like during heavy exercise, the ventral respiratory group, or VRG, kicks in. The VRG assists by sending active signals for forced exhalation, powerfully emptying the lungs to prepare for the next cycle. Above the medulla sits a modifier module called the Pons. The Pons houses two distinct nodes, the apneustic and pneumotaxic centers, which fine-tune the raw rhythm generated below. These pontine centers work in opposition. The apneustic center pushes to prolong the depth of your inspiration. To prevent the lungs from expanding indefinitely, the pneumotaxic center serves as the off switch. It fires an inhibitory signal to limit the duration of the breath, precisely controlling the respiratory rate. The brainstem provides a perfectly consistent autonomous metronome, but a blind metronome operating without feedback would quickly tear the physical tissue of the lungs. The system requires data from the outside world. Because the medullary generator cannot physically see or feel the lungs expanding, it relies on a network of mechanical feedback loops to protect the pulmonary hardware from structural failure. The primary defense against overinflation is the Breuer reflex. Under normal conditions, this reflex remains entirely dormant. It only activates when the tidal volume of a breath exceeds 1.5 liters, the threshold of dangerous physical stretch. Looking at this feedback loop, we see pulmonary stretch receptors embedded directly in the smooth muscle of the bronchi. When inflation crosses that 1.5-liter threshold, these receptors fire afferent impulses up to the brainstem via the vagus nerve, immediately inhibiting the inspiratory center and forcing an exhalation. Secondary airway reflexes handle acute physical threats. Irritant receptors lining the tracheal epithelium detect noxious gases or particulates, completely bypassing the normal rhythm to trigger a violent forced exhalation, what we recognize as coughing or sneezing, to clear the obstruction. The system can also anticipate physical stress before it registers in the blood. Proprioceptors located in the muscles and joints sense physical movement. The moment you begin to run, these joint sensors signal the respiratory centers to ramp up ventilation, staying ahead of the impending metabolic demand. While mechanical and proprioceptive reflexes protect the lungs, the primary drive of the respiratory circuit remains metabolic chemistry. At its core, respiration exists to manage three distinct chemical variables in the blood: oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ion concentration, or pH. The entire neurological apparatus answers to these chemical markers. This anatomical illustration pinpoints the body's primary oxygen sensors. These are the peripheral chemoreceptors, located precisely within the carotid bodies in the neck, and the aortic bodies resting directly on the arch of the heart. These peripheral sensors do not micromanage your breathing. They act as an emergency alarm. They only trigger a massive compensatory spike in ventilation when the partial pressure of oxygen in your arteries collapses below 60 millimeters of mercury, a state of severe, life-threatening hypoxia. In standard physiological states, minute-to-minute breathing regulation tracks the accumulation of carbon dioxide rather than oxygen levels. Hypoxia is a late-stage catastrophic trigger. The body's true respiratory pacemaker is the management and elimination of carbon dioxide waste. To monitor this CO2 accumulation, the brain relies on the central chemoreceptors, located directly on the medulla. These sensors dictate the precise rate and depth of every normal breath you take. This schematic illustrates the challenge at the blood-brain barrier. The actual marker of metabolic acidity is the hydrogen ion, but hydrogen ions circulating in the bloodstream are charged. The tight junctions of the blood-brain barrier physically repel them, blocking them from entering the cerebrospinal fluid. To bypass this, the brain utilizes an evolutionary workaround. While hydrogen is blocked, systemic carbon dioxide is highly lipid-soluble. It diffuses effortlessly across the blood-brain barrier and slips directly into the clear space of the cerebrospinal fluid. Once inside, a critical hydration reaction takes place. The CO2 combines with water to form carbonic acid. That acid immediately dissociates, stripping away bicarbonate and releasing free hydrogen ions directly inside the brain's fluid. The central chemoreceptors detect this localized, highly concentrated acid bloom. In response, they fire intense excitatory signals to the respiratory centers, driving the lungs to hyperventilate and blow off the excess systemic CO2. The brain uses a chemical proxy, converting a dissolved gas into an internal acid bath to guarantee that metabolic waste is detected and cleared before it reaches toxic concentrations. Up to this point, the entire circuit is an automatic loop. But unlike the cardiovascular system, your lungs are uniquely required for complex, conscious behaviors like talking, singing, and swallowing. To execute these actions, the system grants temporary administrative access to the neocortex, the region of the brain responsible for conscious, voluntary thought. Looking at this neural map, you can see the exact mechanism of control. Cortical efferent pathways originate in the neocortex and physically circumvent the medullary respiratory centers, synapsing directly onto the spinal motor neurons. This direct anatomical bypass allows your conscious mind to take direct manipulation of the diaphragm and intercostal muscles. You can halt the metronome simply by choosing to. The cortex has the power to hijack the biological ventilator, but this architectural quirk sets the stage for an inevitable physiological conflict between conscious will and metabolic reality. Because the cortex possesses a direct neural bypass to the respiratory muscles, a profound physiological question emerges. Why is it mechanically impossible to voluntarily hold your breath until you die? In the initial phase of a voluntary breath hold, the cortex wins. It successfully transmits an inhibitory signal down the spinal cord, suppressing the natural rhythm of the medullary generator. But as pulmonary ventilation stops, the metabolic engine continues running. Systemic carbon dioxide begins to rapidly accumulate within the bloodstream. That CO2 diffuses across the blood-brain barrier. The hydration reaction floods the cerebrospinal fluid with hydrogen ions, and the central chemoreceptors begin to fire with increasing intensity. A neurological conflict begins at the brainstem. Ascending excitatory signals from the chemical sensors grow stronger with every passing second, fighting against the descending inhibitory commands from the cortex. This visualization maps out the breaking point. At a precise threshold of hypercapnia, the excitatory signals from the chemical sensors overwhelm cortical control. The chemical drive forces a massive involuntary diaphragmatic contraction. You breathe whether you want to or not. The respiratory circuit functions as an integrated hierarchy, a brainstem rhythm, optimized by mechanical feedback, and temporarily directed by conscious thought, all of which yields to the baseline requirements of metabolic chemistry.